Welcome to Inside the Deal. I'm Suzanne Stevens. I'm here with Jeff Marwil. Jeff co-chairs the Restructuring and Insolvency Group at Winston Strawn. Jeff, we're here to talk about the possibility of bankruptcy in the auto industry. Is bankruptcy inevitable for either GM or even Chrysler, even with government funding on the table?
I don't know whether it is inevitable. It should be. There should be a bankruptcy filing in order to give the car companies the best opportunity possible to restructure and to successfully emerge as a viable enterprise.
Well, let's drill down in that a little bit. So how does a bankruptcy actually achieve that?
Bankruptcy provides a process by which the non-debtor parties to contracts and obligations owing by the car companies can be forced into accepting concessions. The bankruptcy court and the bankruptcy statute provide opportunities for both sides in both negotiations, and then ultimately, if the court needs to make a decision in decision making, the process can happen relatively quickly, and it can happen on a level playing field in a manner that's transparent to all parties. Outside of bankruptcy, there is not that transparency, and the playing field is not necessarily level, and unfortunately would probably be tilted toward the unions and the non-debtor parties to the contracts and financial obligations, because they're not required outside of bankruptcy to compromise their contractual rights.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that, but bankruptcy, so you're saying bankruptcy, it provides the legal framework to get all parties to the table, something that a car czar would not be able to do.
Right. I think of a car czar as an arbitrator, and arbitration is voluntary, generally speaking, and outside of bankruptcy, where there is not the teeth of a bankruptcy judge and the teeth of a bankruptcy statute that gives rights to the debtor to compromise its financial obligations, to terminate or reject its contracts, to terminate its legacy expense with the retirees. None of those things are required to happen outside of bankruptcy, and it's purely voluntary on the part of the non-debtor parties.
Does in a bankruptcy proceeding, can the union contract simply be terminated?
It can be. There are a lot of protections. It's Section 1113 of the Bankruptcy Code. There are protections on both sides to protect both the debtor and the debtor's financial constituents, as well as to protect the union and the union employees. And there are timeframes and requirements that will be imposed by the statute and by the bankruptcy court in order to make sure that if the contract is rejected, it's done so only after a very fair and thorough opportunity was had to negotiate modifications.
Isn't there a huge incentive for the unions, maybe not so much the retirees, but to find a solution, a workable solution that's going to keep the car companies operating?
I think the answer is yes, and I was surprised to see the unions unwilling to say yes last week when the Senate asked them to immediately agree to wage concessions.
They was kind of under the gun. It was like, agree to these concessions and you'll get the money.
And I understand that it's hard for a union president to say yes, but to categorically say no, I think places the union and the constituents in the union, which include the retirees, at much greater risk inside of bankruptcy.
What role would the federal government play in a bankruptcy, or should it play?
Well, I think it could play either the role of a direct lender if there is insufficient funding from the commercial banks to provide the loans, and if there is sufficient funding at the commercial banks to provide the loans, the government could play a guarantor, so that the banks have a willingness and a desire to actually loan the money, and knowing that the government is there to backstop it.
In this market right now, how realistic do you think it is that the banks could come forward with money, or would come forward with money?
I think the government would have to do most, if not all, of the direct lending. I don't think there is I don't think there's enough liquidity in the marketplace right now to support the kind of funding, whether it's $15 billion or $25 billion or $34 billion. I don't know that the commercial banks are going to tie up that much money in this one industry, even with government backing.
If GM or Chrysler and or both files for bankruptcy, how long would a case like that take to wind through the courts?
I would think that it would be months and years. It would be a very long, protracted proceeding, at least initially. I think, depending on how the car companies do in terms of sales, which I think is the key focus, properly so by the executives. If the sales hold up, then they have a little bit of runway to really negotiate and accomplish a strong restructuring. If the sales don't hold up, then it's going to either be a race to avoid liquidation, and it'll be a race by everybody. It'll be the non-debtor parties as well as the company, the debtor, looking for a solution as quickly as possible to emerge from bankruptcy and rescue the sales levels.
Jeff Marwil with Winston & Strawn, thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
I'm Suzanne Stevens. Thanks for watching Inside the Deal.